Hi, this is the second of the two videos I'm going to make about bibliography, or about documentation, sorry. The first one was about citations, which um, happen in your paper when you quote or summarize or paraphrase something. You cite the source by naming the author um, and giving the page number if there is one, and date if it's APA style. That happens in the paper. This video is about the bibliography, which is the second half of the documentation system, and that happens at the end of your paper. There's a separate sheet that's the bibliography. That's the generic name for it. In MLA, it's called works cited, and in APA, it's called references. And why do they do that? I don't know. I think other systems call it other things, including sometimes bibliography. But as I said before, when you're doing documentation, you can ask questions and try to figure out why things are the way they are. And sometimes you can figure it out and it makes sense. But you can also just remember that the game is just to follow the rules, right? To look in the rule book, which will tell you what to do. Right? I said at the beginning of the last video that I don't want you to have to clutter your mind up with all the rules that they have about MLA and APA. It's not worth knowing because you can always look it up, and it changes all the time. It seems like every few years they revise the rules. Partly, I think, because electronic sources have been changing so fast for 20 years. They're trying to figure out a system for documenting things that move. Books and periodicals in the day of print, they get published and they just were where what they were. But electronic stuff, they can be revised, they can change, they can you know be found on multiple websites. You know there are all kinds of changes, right? They're more fluid. So the MLA and APA handbooks get revised as I said, it seems like every few years. So it's not worth knowing the rules because the rules change. Right? This raises another important issue. For your paper, you're going to be using this book, the Little Seagull Handbook, this edition. And that's important to keep in mind because when I grade your paper, I'll grade according to how well you made it fit the rules that are in this book. If you have an older book or somehow have a newer book, I don't think there is a newer one, but if you had a different edition, you might end up with a bibliography or works cited that looks somewhat different. And I'm gonna, I have to have some standard to grade by. And so what I'm trying to teach you is not any particular system, but how to use a system. And for this class, this is the system, the one that's in this book, right? Or the ones that are in this book. Does that seem clear? There's also, I'm sure you must know, there are bibliography generators online. In fact, if you go to our college's library website, on the home page, there's a link to a citation maker. And, the fact that it's there should tell you something. That's not cheating to use those. Those can be a useful tool, and it'll ask you what's the title of your document, what kind of document is it, when was it published, volume number, and all that. And you put it in, and it'll generate the bibliography entry for you. But, or I should say, why is it that we would bother to learn a system if there are online tools to do it? Well, there's a very good reason, and it's this. When you're not only going to be a writer of bibliographies. As a college student, you're going to be a reader of bibliographies. You're going to have to know what's going on in a bibliography when you're confronted with one. Right? You'll have to make one for your paper, true, but then when you're doing your research and you come across a bibliography, it's important to be able to look at it and be able to interpret it. So I think of it as being like doing long division. I remember in, I don't know, 5th grade or whatever, learning how to do long division, and it seemed like a tedious, kind of complicated project process. And even learning how to multiply longhand, that seems like a real drag now because we can do it so easily with a machine. So why did we learn that? Because it's important to have the concepts so you can, not only get the answer, but you can understand what's going on, right? When you got a college degree, you're then expected to be one of the grown-ups who, knows how to, not just knows how to receive things that other people give you, but you know how to produce them, interpret them, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's why we're learning bibliography here. And again, the basic single rule of all of it is you can look in the book, right, and see what the book tells you to do. I put on Moodle, you might have seen a document that tells you how to access something called Inquisitive, and it's an interactive online teaching tool for learning a bunch of stuff from the Little Seagull Handbook. It's tied to the Little Seagull Handbook. It's by Norton, who's the publisher of this book. And so it's an interactive tool that will direct you to the appropriate pages or section numbers in this book. And I strongly recommend that you do a little bit of work on it. It's described in the Moodle assignment that I gave you, specifically what I want you to do. But they have a section on bibliography and documentation, bibliography and citations. And it'd be useful to go through that just because a little bit of practice and it will begin to sink in. When you do your internet credibility information literacy exercise, let me start over. Information literacy exam at the end of the week, Friday. It'll also be helpful for that because working with Inquisitive for a little while will help you get, a little bit clearer about how bibliography works, and then some of the questions in the information literacy exam will be easier. I should note, since we're talking about that, when you do the information literacy exam, it's open book. You can use your Little Seagull Handbook because, again, I don't want you to have to try to memorize rules for how bibliographies, citations, any of that stuff goes. I want you to be able to look it up, right? This is information literacy. It's knowing your way around information. It's not storing all the information in your head, but knowing how to access it and use it, right? So, okay. You remember that I said your paper can either use APA or MLA system, but whichever one you choose, you need to be consistent with it and follow the rules of that system. If we're talking about bibliography, the references or the work cited, depending on which system you're working with, MLA and APA have a couple of things, important things that are in common in their bibliographies. First of all, they're listed by author's last name, comma, first name, period. Why do they do that? Why do they always say Reitz, comma, John instead of John Reitz? Well, here's the reason. We want the last name out at the margin because we're going to be alphabetizing the last names, right? So you can look for, if you say something like Reitz says, in your paper, then you want the reader to be able to come to the bibliography and be able to look alphabetically and find that last name, and there will be the entry. Right? Okay, so it's last name, comma, first name, period. You alphabetize all of your bibliography entries by last name, right? That's how they're organized. They don't have any numbers. They're not organized according to where they appear in your paper or anything like that. You just have a list of books and articles and websites that you used, and then you alphabetize them by the last name of the author or by the name of the organization if there is no author. As I said, they're not numbered, and they have this thing called a hanging indentation. And I didn't leave myself a lot of room here, but I'll try to show you anyway, the little bit I have. So normally when you're writing a paragraph, you indent the first line by hitting the tab bar, right? And then everything else is at this margin, right? And this one is indented 5 spaces more or less, right? Like 1 tab key. Well, that's just a regular indentation. What they call hanging indentation for bibliographies, the first line is at the margin, and then all the other ones are indented, however long the entry is. Right? So you can see that I have here, 4 different entries, and the last name of the author will be out here at the margin. And then if it takes 2 or 3 lines, those lines are the indented ones. They call it hanging indentation because it looks like this part is hanging from that first line. But we do that so that the last name will pop out at the margin because that's what the reader is going to be looking for, right? Hanging indentation. A better way to understand hanging indentation might be, if you don't have your little Seagull handbook out, why don't you get it out now, because it'll be helpful for all of the rest of this video. I think I mentioned in the last video that Little Seagull Handbook has models of both MLA and APA papers at the end of the sections. So on page 161 and following is a model of what an MLA paper is going to look like. Therefore, on page 168, at the back of that model, you'll see what a works cited page looks like. Let's see, it's alphabetized by author's last name. It's got the hanging indentation. It's not numbered. It's all just double spaced, right? Just as I said. So that's what a works cited page looks like. If we look at the end of the APA section, we will see page 207. You'll see a model of a references page in MLA and in APA. And again, you can see that it's got the hanging indentation and it's alphabetized by author's last name. You probably can't read it on the computer here, but if you have your book, you can see that. Okay. So what I want to do is, first I want to check my notes, make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Yes. I want to emphasize again, it's not worth learning the systems because they change and they're just, a bunch of picky rules that are not worth knowing, right? So when you go to make a bibliography, the basic method is this. If you look in your book, we'll start with MLA, start with the familiar. On page 129, we have a section about making a list of works cited. And they begin by talking about the core elements. MLA talks about these core elements, these important things that are supposed to be in a bibliography entry. Author, title, editor, volume, publisher, date, location, all these things, right? But then, starting on page 134, we get a series of several dozen examples, models that show you how to build a bibliography. The first seven talk just specifically about authors and how you present the author in a works cited entry. If you have one author, it's very standard, obvious, easy. If you have two, well, it shows you a model for that. You invert the last name of the first author so you can get that out at the margin, but you don't invert the names of second and third authors because there's no reason to, right? If you have two or more works by the same author, if you have no author, or if some organization or government agency is the author, you've got different models to follow there. All right, then comes the main event. On page 136, they begin with their models of different kinds of works cited entries for different kinds of sources. And they begin with articles and other short works, right? They do that because with research, college research, articles are pretty darn important because that's where a lot of the detailed, professional journals are where a lot of the detailed cutting edge information appears. So they give you examples. If you have an article in a journal, here's your model. If you have, page 139, an online journal, this is what it looks like. If you have an article in a magazine, well, if it's in print, here's your model. If it's online, there's the model. If you have an article in a newspaper, etc., etc. So they've got all these different models that you can follow. The game is find the model that you think best fits the source that you have, and then follow that model. After the section on articles, the next section is about books and parts of books, right? And it continues on. Numbers 17 and following are the basic entry for a book, an ebook, an anthology, which is a collection of articles. I showed you in the last video about that. If what you have is an essay in a book full of essays, then number 19 is your model. On and on, different kinds of books. And then on page 149, you have a section that talks about how to cite websites. So you have a section on articles, books, and websites. Those are the three basic kinds of sources. But then there's this kind of a garbage can category at the end, other kinds of sources. Personal communication, social media, audio visual, an interview, a broadcast, a podcast, a film, a court case, yada yada. So if you're using some kind of weird source, they've got models for that as well. Okay. Let's go back to page 136, to the beginning of the section on articles. In addition to talking you through it and giving you models, which they do in every section, they also give you, they show you what the works cited entry will look like in your paper, but then they also show you what the source itself might look like. So here they give you an example here of a page, the first page out of a paper journal, a printed journal. and they tell you where you can find the title, the author, the volume number, yada yada. And it's nice. They color code it and show, you know, where everything ends up in the works cited entry. Then they do the same thing for an article in an online magazine. And then they do the same thing for, this will be relevant for you perhaps, a periodical article out of a database. And again, it's all color coded with arrows showing you where you probably get volume number and page number and digital online DOI. I forget what DOI stands for. All those kinds of things. Great. And then books. They've got visual models of books. What they call the title page of the book will have the author, the title, the publisher, and then the back of that page will have the publication date. And then, of course, there is a model for websites. So again, it tells you where to get all the different elements you might need to create a works cited entry for a website that you have. What do you suppose APA does? Basically the same thing, right? We've got a section in APA, starts on page 179 for the references list. That's what they call the bibliography. And they begin with print books. So they tell you, how to cite a print book, and they've got a model for you showing you the title page with title, author, publisher, publication year. They've got different kinds of books, like if the editor is an organization or a government agency, if it's an edited collection, if it's an unknown author, yada yada. Then on page 184, we get a section on periodicals, beginning with print periodicals. This is how you do periodicals if you have hard copies, paper copies. Then you get online sources. They talk about online articles, online websites, etc. And then near the end, personal communication and social media, if you happen to be communicating with like an author personally. And then that garbage can category of audio, visual, multimedia, and other sources, just anything else. Paintings, computer software, a map, a video game, dissertation, etc. So that's it. The book is the source for the models that you're going to use to put together your bibliography. As I said, it's worth doing some by hand so that you understand how they're put together. If you use a citation maker online, citation processor, well, you're going to need to still go through and compare what you get to the appropriate model in here, because it's probably about 40 or 50% of the time different somehow, because it's the citation maker is using a different version of MLA from what we have here. I think that might be it. The plan for the information literacy exam is that I'll make it available at our regular class time on Friday at noon, from noon to 1. Should only take you an hour. If you're unable to do that time, email me and we'll set up something else. All right. The information literacy exam, again, it's 10% of your final grade, so it counts as much as one of the short papers. If you've been making a research paper, a lot of this stuff will seem familiar to you. I'm thinking in class I used to do some sample questions. I don't think that you need me to do that. The questions tend to be, pretty familiar if you have your notes and your little Siegel handbook and you've been paying attention to the stuff that I've been talking about in the other videos. It asks questions about, how do you determine whether a source is credible or not. It asks you questions about citations and bibliography. It'll show you like a bibliography entry and say, what kind of a source is this? And you got to tell them whether it's an article in a magazine or a chapter in a book or what it is. Also, it'll talk to you about methods, like if you're doing a research project, which one of these things should you do first? It's all multiple choice, right? If you think that it would be super helpful to have a few examples, email me, and if there are enough people who are interested in seeing some sample questions, I'll make another video for you to see some sample questions. But as I said, I think it'll be okay without it. Okay, I've never put a test into Moodle, so we'll see how well I do with that. All right. If you haven't turned in your rough draft for the research paper, be sure to turn in a final draft. It's 30% of your final grade. Take care.